Welcome back to Uncensored with me, Jeremy Kyle. Now, as the brutal and tragic war in Ukraine continues, the fragile balance of harmony between the global powers seems more precarious than ever. Tension between China and the US yesterday reached new heights after House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. In response, China today undertook live-fire combat training in the Taiwan Strait. And now good old North Korea's weighed in, warning the states to stay out of their politics. I guess the question is, has the war in Ukraine paved the way for more conflict around the world? Delighted to be joined now by Colonel Richard Kemp, a former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, also Major John Spencer, who is chair of the Urban Warfare Studies at the Madison Policy Forum. But first, Cormac Smith, good friend of mine and former advisor to the Ukrainian Foreign Minister. Lovely to see you, Cormac. Pelosi yesterday, the Al-Qaeda man taken out over the weekend, this vacuum in Afghanistan, and the talk of this axis, you know, this axis of Russia and China and Iran. When you look at Ukraine, is this war, is what Russia is doing, is it a precursor for worse things, in your opinion?
Good evening. It's lovely to see you again. Look, I think we're at 12 minutes to midnight. And I go back to a speech that Sergei Lavrov made at the Munich Security Conference in February in 2017, when he almost rejoiced in the breakup of the post-war order that had given us the rules-based order, that had given us the greatest period of prosperity and security that the world has ever known. And he talked about the emergence of the post-West era. And he talked about how NATO was a Cold War relic. Quite honestly, I think that, we were not listening at the time or paying attention. And the issues that we have now with Nancy Pelosi and China and Taiwan is very, very worrying. The Chinese will sit back, I think, and they will play a long game.
I agree with you. Let's bring in Major John Spencer, military scholar and combat veteran. Major Spencer, thank you for joining us tonight. Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan was met with sort of incredulous disbelief by many people over this side of the pond. You know, she arrived in Taiwan in this sort of Air Force jet. We heard nothing from Biden. And I think many people over here are thinking, was he privately supporting it? Why was nothing publicly said? Because on the surface, and you might tell me differently, hasn't that stoked the fire between the US and China?
I mean, you can't argue that it didn't. I mean, I think President Biden's comments that were bold and said, we will defend Taiwan, was enough of strategic ambiguity. So basically, her visit is another sign of saying we will defend democracy around the world. This isn't, I agree with, this is the greatest test to the rule-based order since World War II. And if you just fall asleep at the wheel, it will end up in major war.
I'd like to bring in as well, if I can, and delighted to have him on the show, Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan. Colonel Richard, many people talking about that vacuum left after the US removed themselves from Afghanistan, but over the weekend, the Al-Qaeda man taken out by the Americans. The question for everybody is, who's next? Where does this all end? For people watching this tonight, what should we be thinking? What should we be fearing, if you like?
Well, I think one of the shocking things was that bin Laden's successor was living a life of comfort in the centre of Kabul 2 decades after the US went in with its allies, including the UK, to get rid of al-Qaeda, to get rid of the Taliban, and now we've got the Taliban ruling again as a result of President Biden's horrendous foreign policy to withdraw unconditionally in such really dire circumstances that showed the world how very weak the United States is, and NATO as well, because, of course, NATO went rushing out with the Americans. And there's no doubt, in my view, that was monitored and looked at carefully by Putin. And that was a factor, I think. America and NATO's weakness was a factor, not necessarily the deciding factor, but a significant factor in his decision to go back in again to Ukraine. And I think, of course, President Xi is watching the weakness from Afghanistan, and also what I consider, and many other people would disagree, the weakness that NATO and the West have shown over Ukraine. Yeah, we've provided a certain amount of military support. We have imposed significant sanctions, but it hasn't been enough because Russia is achieving too much success in Ukraine. And the West has been impotent. NATO's been impotent in handling that. So I think it's provocative.
I have to say I agree with you, Cormac. We've spoken about this many, many times before. You've always said to me the West should do more for Ukraine. We've talked about, you know, the logistical help. We can't put troops on the ground. But is this sending a message to China that Putin has gone into Ukraine, and yes, there are sanctions, and yes, there's international outrage, but he's still there, and maybe China's looking at Taiwan and going, well, actually, we could do the same. That's what we're talking about, right?
I think it's too early to draw a conclusion yet. There are green shoots of recovery coming out of Ukraine, certainly, and these new weapons, which the other two gentlemen on the panel will be far better qualified to talk about than myself, but the HIMARS the Ukrainians are making very smart use of them, and they are making a big, big difference. There's also evidence that, as General Lord Dannatt said recently, that Russia has shot its bolt, to quote him directly. There is evidence that their advance is slowing down significantly. So I think China is still watching. My point, what I've made to you, is we simply cannot allow Ukraine to lose. A very good Ukrainian friend of mine, senior diplomat, said recently, if Ukraine wins, there is no war. If Ukraine loses, there is no Ukraine.
Well, this is really interesting. I bring Major Spencer back in from the States. John, the interesting thing is the Americans are undoubtedly looking at what's happened in Ukraine, as I guess China is. Do you think America could have been stronger? Yes, we know about the Al-Qaeda thing, but I just wonder whether China is sitting there waiting. And you know, a cynic said to me today, did Pelosi go to Taiwan with Biden's, you know, with his blessing privately because of the midterms? One doesn't really know, I have to say, from a personal point of view, what the American administration truly thinks right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that America did not. They're failing Ukraine today, in my opinion, and we failed Ukraine in the beginning. And China's not Russia. If we wait 6 months to help to go full in, which you still haven't in Ukraine, just in aid to Taiwan, Taiwan won't survive a month. Russia is a test of the world order, and he is achieving what he wanted. And if we don't stop him in Ukraine, then this does lead to a complete unraveling of the global order that we've all enjoyed since post-World War II.
I think we all agree, and I'd love to have more time, gentlemen. I haven't. I think we all agree that that world order is in danger, is threatened, and what will happen over the next few weeks and months we must watch very closely. Major John Spencer, thank you very much indeed. Also, Cormac Smith, thank you, and also Richard Kemp. I appreciate all of you being involved tonight. Thank you so much indeed. Right, next on Uncensored.